Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Yep. How you doing? Welcome to the program. It's September 18th, in case you're keeping score. There's an election tomorrow. Probably not for you. I know not for me. But some of you, if you were in the House district that was represented by Sarah Inamarato, who is now running for Allegheny County Executive, there is an election tomorrow to replace her. It's an important election. We have only a one vote, we being Democrats, have only a one vote majority. Well, I guess it's tied up right now, right? Is this the one that puts it over? I don't know. Really important. Do you know the number of your state house district? I don't. I'm just telling you, there's an election tomorrow. And the Republican, who's both women are running, both candidates are women, I think is what I wanted to say. The Republican was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. She said, well, I went to see the president's last speech. Last speech. Jesus, God. She also said she supports a statewide ban on abortion. That's who's running. So if you know anyone who lives in that district, make sure they get their vote in tomorrow, okay? And the Democrat who's running would, if elected, and she should be elected, would be the first black representative in that district, which is vastly majority white district. So interesting. Excuse me. Speaking of black and white, I have to get to the funniest story so far that I've seen all day, which is that a stealth fighter jet is missing. I mean, you can't make that up. They can't find it. Have they found it? I don't think. I mean, that's a pretty big piece of equipment. They can't find it. I guess the transponder ain't working. Well, it's a stealth jet, so it's not supposed to be easily found. On the other hand, it ain't flying. It's on the ground. It's pilotless. It's the pilot ejected, leaving the plane to fly itself until, I guess, it runs out of fuel, which means it would crash. So I'm just saying that's sort of funny. If you don't mind $80 million going just like that. It's the kind of headache you can bet that the folks at the Pentagon would rather not have had to deal with today. But I came across a piece of history this weekend, which just really interested me because as the person who educated me about something I did not know said, that this guy, a guy named Thomas Smallwood, is probably the most fascinating and important black activist and writer you've never heard of. And I agree. Never heard of him. I never heard of him. Thomas Smallwood. I got to tell you about him. He was born a slave, 1801. And the little piece on him that I read didn't explain how he pulled it off, but he managed to educate himself and buy his own freedom. And that he managed by 1831, which means he was 30 years old, and he had educated himself and somehow made money and bought his freedom. So right there, remarkable. And we pick up the story where he is a free black man living in Washington, D.C., really close. His house is right near the Capitol building. And he lives there with his wife and 4 children. Ran a successful shoemaking business. That was by day. But by night, Thomas Smallwood was organizing escapes from slavery. From Washington, from Baltimore, surrounding counties, by the wagon load. And he was a writer. So he wrote articles that were published in an abolitionist newspaper in New York under a pseudonym. I guess if you're living as he was, you wouldn't want to draw attention to yourself, like if he had used his own name. And his style of writing, because there's some examples, is so wonderful. Because here is a black man in 1840 something, 20 years before the Civil War. And he mocks slave owners, just mocks them. Listen to part of his style. When he did a story about, the rage of the establishment as they looked for a runaway slave. And he said, well, I guess that walking piece of property just walked off. And then he addressed the slave owner and said, it was your cruelty that made him disappear by that underground railroad. Now, the term underground railroad had never been used before. Well, it had been used once before by an officer of the law who'd been looking for the runaway slave and was so sputtering angry at how someone could just poof, disappear, that he said, why, that damned rascal got off. No trace of him. Must have been on a underground railroad. Now, there was no such thing as an underground railroad. That would be like a subway, right? They didn't exist then. So it was like saying he must have been teleported. How does somebody just escape? But Thomas Smallwood loved the fact that this sputtering slave chaser was squawking about it must have been magic. It must have been an underground railroad. So he begins using the term to refer to that reverse migration of walking property, walking off. So it was Thomas Smallwood who coined, essentially, created the phrase Underground Railroad. He began constantly talking in his columns about this mythical transport system that sped people out of bondage. And he did it in a mocking tone. You know, it wasn't as if he was talking about something that existed. He was talking about the success that he and others had in freeing slaves. And he taunted slave owners. He said, if you're bewildered by the disappearance of your enslaved workers, please apply at the office of the Underground Railroad in Washington for information on your lost property. He appointed himself the general agent of all the branches of the National Underground Railroad. All of this meant to mock slave owners. Now, this was not something that was known. So this is something that is coming out, I guess, in a new book. All this time, the mythological nature of the Underground Railroad. And in fact, this guy goes on to say that it began, in fact, to create a different kind of mythology that was not real. The reality is most slaves who escaped on their own. The property walked. No help from anybody. And as more sympathetic white people started to help in this effort, in as much as it was organized, they began to get a lot of the credit. And so the role of somebody like a Thomas Smallwood would be eclipsed by the attention that was paid to the white allies on the Underground Railroad. This is classic America, right? White people getting lauded for work done mostly by Black people. And even though Smallwood himself was a free man, he was a free man living in the South, Washington, D.C., in the South, in the 1840s, excuse me, and he never felt safe. And he ended up running himself, even though he was a free man. He took his family and ran to Canada in 1843. And he started a business there. He had very low expectations of what the United States was capable of in terms of living up to its mythology. And he wrote in a memoir in 1851 that the United States will never voluntarily grant the African race freedom. The most fascinating Black activist and writer you've never heard of, Thomas Smallwood. And in his writing, the mockery that he rained down on white slave owners. Just wondrous. In his eye, they were a dim race of morally bankrupt fools. The enslaved, on the other hand, were noble, clever. He said a shrewd slave has wit enough at any time to get around a lazy, mole-eyed slaveholder. That's a black voice from pre-Civil War. Unlike, excuse me for my, it's hay fever season. Unlike we're, I think, used to hearing. Sad news today. I saw just before I came on that for those of you who used to listen to AM radio, remember AM radio? The morning, because the morning shows were the biggies. O'Brien and Gary was one of those morning shows. It was on WTAE AM where I got my start in radio. Those were two funny guys, John Gary, Larry O'Brien, and sad news today that John Gary has died. He was 91, long life, good guy, always nice to me. Was really nice to me. They were funny. Want to note it. So, I'm not sure what news has been floating your boat, but I sigh. I sigh because, yeah, it's, again, the news is tough. I was at a holiday dinner for the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, with friends, and somebody pointed out how they'd been with people who were just full-on Trumpers. And these are successful people. They are educated people. And it just blows my mind. And he was saying that he didn't push back much, the guy who was telling the story, because it was they was at their home and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, we're past the point at which normal politeness, I mean, the stakes are so high that if I consider people, the things that these people were saying, I mean, just full on crazy, Phil, that they do not deserve any measure of normal respect. The rules, they and their side have broken all the rules. That's how they play the game. That's what they've shown us. And yet we're supposed to uphold the rules by not offending them. These times are every bit as fraught, if not more so, than they were in the 1840s with Thomas Smallwood making his observations. And we are in another war, civil war, an incivil war, uncivil war. And for us to maintain, just like the media seems confused, to maintain, to operate under the rules. It's like one boxer saying, well, of course I will honor the Queensberry rules as I take on this fight. Well, the other is, mixed martial arts. That's not a fair fight. And it is only we who handicap our side, ourselves, by acting as if something extraordinary isn't happening and requires extraordinary responses. I don't know. Tom Nichols, writing for The Atlantic, as you know, I really like his work. And he focused on the Romney quote that I did as well, that was just a sort of one-off in this book excerpt that had come out when he announced he would not run for re-election. And the book excerpt was a very large portion of my party really doesn't believe in the Constitution. Which is obvious, but which is frightening. Because what it means is that millions of Americans, including our friends who invite us to their homes for dinner, who feed us and regale us with their stupidity, millions of Americans that we continue to treat respectfully, no longer believe in democracy, the Constitution of our nation, which is the playbook for the democracy that we are barely holding on to at the moment. They would dismantle it. They're very open about it. And Tom Nichols says, look, if Republicans no longer care about the Constitution, then they no longer care about the rule of law. They no longer care about secular tolerance, fair elections, the protection of basic human rights. And all of that is obvious, again, because they're attacking all those things. Fair elections, protection of basic human rights, the rule of law, and secular tolerance. They have no interest in safeguarding this country's democracy. Not at all. In fact, they seek to, as Nichols puts it, commandeer the ship of state, pillage the hold, and then crash us all onto the rocks. Policy? They have no policies. It's irrelevant. The people Romney was speaking of in his party, who control his party, are not policy wonks. They're opportunists. They're rage junkies. they could care less about any policy. And there is no way to contend in a rational or civic way with this combination of white-hot resentment and ice-cold cynicism that the Republican Party now offers us. No way to contend in a rational or civic way. We're looking at the beginning of authoritarianism in the United States. And we should be grateful, Nichols points out, that so far, Donald Trump and those surrounding him have all been too selfish and too incompetent to totally succeed in taking us down. And he goes on to say this: I have written before that we can no longer indulge Republicans and their various media enablers in the fantasies that Trump is a normal candidate, that we are heading into a normal election, that the Republican Party is a normal party or indeed a political party at all. Let us have no pretenses, even in our daily interactions, that we live in normal times. The 2024 is just another horse race. I guess we tend to talk to people who agree with us, so I sort of thought everybody understood that, but it's quite clear everybody doesn't. And there are a lot of wishy-washy, squishy people in the middle who just want things to go on like they were. They don't want their lives, their social relationships upended in any way. And I'm sorry. That old coal miners song. Whose side are you on? We're in a time when you have to choose. And you have to stand. Whose side are you on? There's a fascinating piece in, I don't know if it's in the print today. It popped up as an essay in the Times. It wasn't in the print paper. So it should be in the next day or so. And it's written by excuse me, sorry, a guy named Yoel Roth, who is one of the growing number of people in this country who is now living in a state of terror. And the terror is a result of the intimidation and thug tactics of the authoritarian, neo-fascist Republican types. He's a guy who's had to relocate more than once, upend his family, leave his home, all because Donald Trump was the first one who called him out. And then Elon Musk called him out. And see, both of those guys command an army of terrorists. And they go right to work as soon as Musk, Trump, any of these people point a finger. They go right to work, threatening people's lives, sometimes trying to kill them, harm them. So that people end up spending unbelievable amounts of money on security. I mean, we can look at what's going on with the upcoming trials of Trump. Every prosecutor, every juror, every witness, every judge, everyone who has anything to do with that is now living with armed guards around them. And this, as L. Roth points out in this piece he wrote, is part of the playbook they use. Intimidation. They'll go after people. They'll go after corporations. And they have an impact because, as we know, they have this huge group of millions upon millions of Americans who believe that their country's being taken from. Well, they believe what we believe. We all believe our country's being taken from us. God, on that we'll agree. But this is a guy who had worked at Twitter before Musk bought it, and he was the guy who was the head of the. Excuse me while I choke on this title. He was the head of the Trust and Safety Committee. So he's the one who took Donald Trump's Twitter account away long after it should have been. This guy writes, nothing prepared me for what would happen next. Trump publicly attacked me. And then 2 years later, following his acquisition of Twitter, Elon Musk added fuel to the fire. And I have lived with armed guards outside my home and have had to upend my family, go into hiding for months and months and repeatedly move. And I have learned that what happened to me and is happening to me was not and is not an accident. It wasn't just personal vindictiveness or cancel culture. It was a strategy. One that affects not just targeted individuals like me, but all of us, as it is rapidly changing what we can see online. Because private individuals, from, I don't know, university researchers to employees of tech companies, are increasingly the targets of the right in lawsuits, in congressional hearings by these madcap and mad Republicans in the House, and vicious online attacks. And the tactic, the strategy, has the desired effect. Universities cut back on efforts to, do whatever it is the attackers don't want them to do. They get scared. They get intimidated. Social media companies shy away from making the kind of difficult decisions that this guy did when he intervened with Trump's account. And he says because this guy knows how this works. He says, faced with the prospect of disproportionate attacks on their employees, companies seem increasingly reluctant to make controversial decisions, and thus misinformation and abuse fester in order to avoid provoking public retaliation. So he's saying the corporations are running scared of these guys. And people, individuals, and universities, and social media companies. And he points out that it's not just in this country where the authoritarians are coming after everything and everybody. He points out that in India, it's a very scary thing to work for Twitter and be within reach of Modi's thugs. He says this guy says more than 40 major elections are scheduled to take place in 2024. Obviously here, but also the European Union, India, Mexico. And all of these countries will likely face the same risks, disinformation campaigns, online incitement of violence, and all through social media. And he said, we should be worried. These are times that call out for courage. And we're seeing that it's in very short supply. One of the things that it's become obvious and people are starting to say it out loud, something that I suggested was much of the problem, is you wonder why no Republican office holder will stand up and speak out. And it's a very simple reason. They lack courage. They're scared. They are scared for themselves and their literal lives, not just their political existence, although that's probably number one, then their lives, the lives of their children, because the Trump thugs go after people's children, go after families, post pictures of their dogs, hoping someone might maybe harm the animal. And we all know this is happening, but why do we, it's just like you want to take them on. Social media companies are going to destroy us. And this guy says, if these companies cannot safely operate in a country and without exposing their staffs to personal risk, like happened to him, and their own company decisions to undue influence by thugs, terrorists, perhaps then they should not operate there at all. And yet, if we were to pull out of these places, that would worsen the options left to people who have the greatest need for free and open expression. So he offers no easy answers to this. Because the broader challenge, and perhaps the inescapable one, is the essential humanness of online trust and safety efforts. It isn't machine learning models and faceless algorithms behind key content moderation decisions. It's people. And people can be pressured, intimidated, threatened, and extorted. How many qualified people are willing to do that kind of work? Few people could be expected to take a job like that, like he had, if they take it at the cost of their lives or their liberty. He is now a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has armed guards. I have a new term for you. Eco-anxiety. It's not in the, that, what is that called? The DSML, whatever that thing is, that book, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's not clinically recognized as a separate kind of mental illness, but it's out there. And as one psychiatrist said, climate change is moving faster than psychiatry, for sure. And so the term is already there. And when you read what especially younger people are saying, it just breaks your heart. It does. It breaks your heart. Here's a 27-year-old in Rome. My family thinks I have a future to worry about. I think I don't. Now, that's someone, a young person, who looks at the world and feels hopelessness, which is always self-defeating. I hope he can somehow rise above it. Hopelessness. And then there are others, and these are the ones that us old folks are counting on. The ones when we say, well, the young people will save us or something, save the planet. The fact is that the eco-anxiety also helps spur in some activism. And it's becoming apparent all over the world because the whole world, the opportunity for a global movement here is incredible if you think about it, right? Because a kid in Rome and a kid in Poughkeepsie and a kid in Johannesburg are all dealing with the same reality of the planet seemingly turning on us. And the potential for the negatives, people just going stark raving mad, turning to authoritarians, right? Because people do that when they're scared. Definitely is there. But the other side is that this could unite people who otherwise would not be united. Because this is the kind of threat that doesn't care what your politics are, what your income is, where you live, what language you speak. It's a common enemy. It's sort of like that, sci-fi trope of, aliens invading the earth. And lo and behold, the earth, the people of the earth band together as one. And I mean, if there was ever a threat, so clearly a common threat, that could provide the impetus for that kind of global, activist, radical movement, well, it's here. And I suspect it will be young people who will lead the way. So while this article I read was all doom and gloom about this shared, increasingly chronic fear felt by people of all ages, all over the world, maybe there's opportunity here. Here's another child, a 16-year-old, a Greek. She's in Greece, watching TV and seeing everything burn. Hard to stay interested in world problems when there won't be a world. Every summer will be hotter. It will always be worse. See, now these are two kids. They chose these quotes because the story they wanted to tell is such a downer of a story. But I am sure there are quotes to be had from young people who are responding to exactly what these two depressed kids are. In a more positive way. It's sort of like, fight or flight, right? People like this are fleeing. They're just shutting down. But there's nothing that will help us if we shut down. The only possible survival skill right now is fight. So they're saying that, apparently, this is something where even the Greek government has noticed that it's something they have to address. As this would never happen in the United States, where we don't address any mental health issues, barely address physical health issues. But Greece has really taken it recently. And if you stop and think about it, you might recall they had a huge financial crisis. That was in 2010, where they almost were forced into bankruptcy as a nation. Do you remember that? And difficult kinds of choices that had to be made and things to do that were not pleasant if you were a Greek citizen, to try to pull the country out of the mess it was in. And then that got followed by the migrant crisis. Desperate people from other countries in boats, right? So the Greek people, who were struggling just to keep themselves afloat, end up with these poor souls also trying to keep afloat, literally and figuratively. And then there was the pandemic. And then there was an inflation crisis there. And then the energy crisis. And finally now the climate crisis. And Greeks are reeling And a Greek psychologist who was interviewed in this says, constant stress has a deeper impact on mental health than short-lived stresses. The person who's already struggling due to higher rent will be hit harder when his home floods. And these piled on situations, which will happen to so many of us. So, eco anxiety. In a way, I was at my doctor's a few weeks ago, and they ask you all these questions. That's what they do. And one of the questions was, have you been dealing with depression? And I looked at this. It was like a nurse asking me. I looked at him and I said, "Are you kidding me?" And he smiled. It wasn't like he didn't know what I was saying. I said, anyone who's not dealing with increased depression right now is not obviously paying any attention at all. But it doesn't have to be debilitating, is what I'm trying to say here. It doesn't have to be debilitating. It can, in fact, show us that we've got work to do. I read something else that really blew me away because it's how different. You grow up in a culture, and and for a long time, it seemed like in my life, Americans seemed to embrace the same kind of ideas about what we were about, even if we weren't always living up to it. But what we were about, that is not necessarily true anymore because of the neo-fascists among us. But countries are different. They grow up with, they come out of different situations. They're burst out of different situations. Cultural differences play. And this has to do with, perhaps you've seen some stories that France is increasingly, I think they're nuts. Now I guess it was a few days before school started, and the education minister said that Muslim girls couldn't wear an abaya to school. In other words, couldn't wear their clothes. That's the clothes. Now, in America, that would be like, what? I mean, that's their religion, and that's what they're supposed to wear. And in our country, the value we have had, there's always pushback, but it is freedom of religion. And it turns out, does not have that value. Freedom of religion. Their value is freedom from religion. The French value the secular democracy. They do not in any way like religion intruding into the governance of their country. And so you see these, what to Americans look like, what? Such an infringement of a person's right to live as their religion suggests. Now, obviously, we'd get into trouble with this too, because religion causes a lot of trouble, if you ask me. So I think it was like almost 20 years ago that they first banned I don't think Jews could wear, a Jewish man couldn't wear a yarmulke, a head, a skull cap. Catholic couldn't wear a big cross. But really what they were after was the Muslims. That's what these laws were about. But I was taken by how different a cultural ethic can be, even amongst friends. So we are French, the French and the Americans are, even if we don't quite understand each other very well, we're allies and generally are allied. We're both democracies of a sort. We both deal with a lot of the same issues. And racism is a biggie in both cases. But for an American to comprehend that for the French, this freedom from religion is difficult. Doesn't seem like it's much of a difference, freedom of or freedom from. Oh, it's a big difference. And I think a lot more Americans are starting to look wistfully at the idea of freedom from. Because religion is behind so much of the tumult that we're struggling with. And religion seems to unhappily be on the right-wing side all too often. When you would think it would be on the left-hand side. If it's Christianity, if it's about being good to your fellow man, if it's about feeding the stranger, taking in the homeless. Yeah, you would think, but religions have been hijacked as well. So I'm looking somewhat wistfully at the French version of this religious thing. Freedom from. And you know what? There cannot be freedom from, as the French are seeing, because freedom from religion creates incredible intolerance. Ask the Muslim girl who all of a sudden can't go to school. But freedom of religion, given the way our Supreme Court has defined it of late, also brings with it intolerance and allows bigotry to grow. It's fascinating how problems, things, life, people, never easy. Just never easy. There's no right way. I can understand both this, somebody arguing eloquently for the French version and someone arguing eloquently for the American ideal, whether it's from or to. And both have merits, both have liabilities, and I would think it shows that there's never a perfect answer for any of this, ever. What makes people nuts? It's why people like authoritarians. They don't have to think anymore. They just have to do what they're told. Man, that makes life easy, huh? I can't imagine who'd want to live that way, but I think a lot of people do. I do. Okay, that's it for me. I'm done. You guys, I'll see you tomorrow. Hope so. Susan should be joining us. And go Steelers! God help them.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.